Sure, I wanted Tate's body, who wouldn't? He looked almost unreal, sex on legs, like something sculpted from Greek marble instead of being born in California, rather than made of the same imperfect things as everyone else. There was a kind of symmetry to him that didn't feel accidental, like every detail had been placed with intention. The kind of physique people chase for years, obsess over, compare themselves to, and still fall short of. If all I ever wanted was Tate's body, I would have gotten over those feelings years ago. Lust alone doesn't survive more than 20 years of desire, longing, intimacy, and genuine affection. For attraction to remain that strong for so long, it has to be rooted in something deeper, something lasting, sentimental, and real. Lust is temporary, seeking convenience and instant gratification. When denied, it fades. What I felt for Tate was different. I never wanted him just for his looks or to make him feel valued only for his appearance. I loved everything that made him who he was, and my feelings were never based solely on physical attraction. His appearance may have caught my eye, but it was never the foundation of what kept my heart with him for all those years. Looking back, I realize I didn't value my relationship with Tate as a platonic source of comfort. Instead, I treated our friendship like a waiting room, believing that its real value depended on whether it eventually became romantic or sexual. It took me nearly 2 decades to understand that genuine affection is not about waiting for someone to become what you hope they will be. It should be enough to appreciate the relationship for what it already is. There is nothing wrong with hoping that a friendship might grow into something more. But you shouldn't put your life on hold while waiting, nor should your self-worth depend on whether those feelings are returned. Sometimes the healthiest outcome is that a friendship remains exactly that, a friendship. I also came to realize that relationships should never be entered with the expectation of being fixed, saved, or repairing something fundamentally broken within yourself. Healthy relationships can encourage growth, but they cannot replace the work of becoming emotionally healthy on your own. Maybe I inspired Tate to become the best version of himself. If I did, I'm grateful. But it was never my responsibility to inspire him, keep him alive, or make him happy. Those burdens were never mine to carry. Likewise, it wasn't his responsibility to meet every emotional need I had. Expecting one person to fulfill every role in your life places an impossible strain on any relationship. Fortunately, through Mark's friendship, I met many wonderful people. Most of them were straight, but they became meaningful friends and reminded me that love, support, and belonging exist in many forms. Mark was my only queer friend, and he helped me understand the differences between friendship, romantic love, and emotional dependence. He taught me that none of those relationships is inherently more valuable than the others. They simply serve different purposes. Tate's violent reactions, breaking things, screaming, or stomping his foot, were never healthy outlets for frustration, anger, or rage. Fortunately, he never directed that anger toward another person or an animal, but that didn't make those reactions healthy ways of coping with conflict or overwhelming emotions. I encouraged Tate to consider therapy, but he reacted as though accepting professional help meant admitting he was broken. I tried to explain that therapy isn't about fixing someone. It's about understanding yourself, developing healthier ways to cope, working toward your goals, and building a more fulfilling life. Seeking help is not a sign of weakness or failure. It's a commitment to personal growth. A year or 2 after my mother died, I began attending therapy myself. I wasn't looking for someone to fix me. I wanted to better understand my past, make sense of my present, and decide what kind of future I wanted to create. Therapy gave me the space to reflect, challenge old patterns, and learn healthier ways of moving forward. That experience changed the way I viewed emotional healing. It wasn't about becoming a different person. It was about becoming a healthier version of the person I already was. Even after 18 months of therapy, I still couldn't fully accept that I had been putting my own life on hold for Tate. By 1988, I had already accepted that we would never have a romantic relationship, yet I continued to center too much of my emotional life and personal identity around him and how he responded to me. Therapy helped me recognize that I had gradually made Tate the emotional center of my world. My mood, my confidence, and even my sense of purpose became tied to his reactions instead of my own values and goals. Slowly, I began to understand that it wasn't healthy for me to exist as Tate's emotional anchor. No one person should carry that responsibility for another, just as no one person should depend on someone else to provide all of their emotional stability. Healthy relationships are built on mutual support, not emotional dependence. Accepting that truth was painful because it meant letting go of the belief that my purpose was to hold Tate together. In reality, both of us deserved the opportunity to stand on our own, supported by friendships, family, and our own inner resilience rather than relying on a single relationship to carry the weight of our emotional lives. Tate's discipline, the control, and the way he took care of himself were second nature. It showed in everything: the sharp definition of his muscles, the strength in the way he moved, the quiet confidence in how he carried his body through a room. And yeah, when his chest was exposed, I couldn't help it, I stared. Anyone would have. It wasn't just attraction, it was instinct. The kind that pulls your attention before you even realize you're looking. The lines of his chest, the way his shoulders broadened, the subtle tension in his muscles even when he was relaxed, it was distracting in a way that felt almost unfair. Like being around him required effort just to stay focused on anything else. But it was never just that. If it had only been physical, I would have walked away. I could have found someone easier, someone less complicated, but Tate was never simple, and what I felt for him was never shallow enough to stay at the surface. I didn't want to stop where everyone else did. I didn't want to be another person who looked at him and saw something to admire, to want to consume. I didn't want to reduce him to the same thing the world always had: a body, an image, something valuable only because of how it looked under the right lighting. I wanted to know him. As a child, I knew very few places that truly felt safe. My mother worked 12-hour shifts 7 days a week, and when she was home, I rarely saw her fully present. Most of the time, she was either asleep on the couch after drinking, already gone to work, or simply not home. When I thought back on my birthdays, I realized my mother had celebrated only 3 of them, and the first 2 were while my father was still alive. More often than not, she would buy me a birthday gift 4 to 6 months later, joking that she was either very late or very early. Around my 8th birthday, I stopped caring. Not because birthdays shouldn't have mattered, but because I had found something that mattered more. Maybe that's why I loved Tate and his family so deeply. They were more than a surrogate family or a place to escape. They became the closest thing I had to a real home. They gave me stability, warmth, laughter, and a sense of belonging during the years when I needed those things most. Looking back, I honestly believe they were the reason I had even a halfway decent childhood. If I had depended only on my mother's presence, or the times when alcoholism made her emotionally unavailable, I might have been raised by a television or by the teachers who cared for me during the school day. Tate and his family gave me something I couldn't find anywhere else: a place where I felt seen, welcomed, and safe. There was one thing I kept secret about my mother's death. No one at her funeral knew that she had been intoxicated when she got behind the wheel. She made a fatal wrong turn while leaving a parking lot. It wasn't because she failed to look both ways. She mistakenly drove out through an entrance instead of the designated exit and collided with another vehicle, seriously injuring the other driver. After the investigation, I learned that her blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit. If she had survived the crash, she would have been arrested for driving under the influence and for seriously injuring another person. She likely would have gone to jail. I asked the officers involved not to share details about her intoxication around town. I couldn't bear the thought of her alcoholism becoming the subject of gossip after her death. As far as the community knew, my mother had died in a tragic car accident. Very few people knew that alcohol had played a role. At the time, I believed I was protecting her memory and preserving what little dignity she had left. Looking back, I realize my feelings were complicated. I was grieving my mother while also grieving the childhood that alcoholism had taken from both of us. Those emotions existed side by side, and neither one erased the other. After Talia helped set up a trust fund for me, I made a decision that I kept private. I donated 15% of it to the woman my mother had injured in the accident. The accident had left her with lasting disabilities. She was unable to work full-time and struggled with severe migraines and chronic back pain because of what happened. I reached out to her and apologized, explaining that my mother had struggled with alcoholism, and that, as the only surviving member of my immediate family, I felt it was the least I could do to take responsibility for the harm that had been caused. I gave her a portion of what my mother had left me, not because I believed it could undo what happened, but because I wanted to acknowledge the impact my mother's actions had on another person's life. I never told anyone about what I did because I wasn't looking for praise, apologies, or sympathy. My mother had spent much of her life making choices without considering the consequences for others, and I couldn't change that after she was gone. But I could choose what I did next. Even though I had complicated feelings about my mother and the pain she caused, I didn't want her legacy to end only with the harm she left behind. After her death, the only thing I could do was try to repair what I could, take responsibility where I was able, and make sure someone who had been hurt was not forgotten. My mother's inheritance and the trust Talia helped establish gave me the ability to set aside a portion of those resources for the person, a former preschool, who had been harmed by my mother's actions. Because of the money I donated, she was able to step away from the pressure of working and focus on her recovery, physical therapy, and achieving the best quality of life possible despite the injuries she had suffered. I knew the money could not undo what happened, but I hoped it could give her security, stability, and the opportunity to heal. I also created provisions in my will stating that, if I were to die before her, she would receive $500,000 along with coverage for any additional medical care she might need. My goal was to make sure she would not have to face financial hardship or choose between her health and her ability to support herself. I did this because I was in a position to help. I couldn't change the past or erase the pain my mother caused, but I could choose to respond with compassion and make sure the person affected by her choices was not left to struggle alone. My mother's alcoholism deeply influenced the way I approached drugs, illicit substances, and alcohol. Even though I was part of the gay club scene in the 1980s and 1990s, I was always careful about the choices I made. I followed Mark's 3 strict rules: only experiment with trusted friends, only be around people who genuinely cared about you, and never put yourself in a situation where someone could leave you vulnerable, abandon you, or take advantage of you. Those rules stayed with me because I understood how quickly a lack of care and responsibility could harm someone's life. I had survived the AIDS crisis, even though I did not fully acknowledge my own sexuality until 1986. At the time, much of my energy was focused elsewhere. I was double majoring through 1990, and I had very little time for the club scene except during summer breaks and Christmas vacations. I took 2 cruises during that period. The first was a few weeks before my mother died in 1990, and the second was in 1992, after my company had been established. Those experiences gave me moments of freedom and enjoyment during years that were also filled with grief, change, and personal growth. Talia's trust and my mother's inheritance gave me the opportunity to build something of my own. I used those resources to start a small software company, Lunas Software Inc., selling electronics and developing software while creating an independent source of income. At one point, Tate expressed a desire to establish a trust for me. I told him I didn't need his money, not out of rejection or ingratitude, but because I was grateful for what Talia had already helped me build and because I had my own company and responsibilities to manage. Tate still wanted to provide for me, so he decided to create a special trust that would ensure I would receive the remaining portion of his inheritance if something happened to him and his family. Tate's family supported the decision and understood that it came from a place of care and trust. However, not everyone agreed. Some of Terrence's business partners, social friends, and professional associates questioned the decision and did not support it. They viewed it differently, while Tate and his family saw it as a personal choice based on a relationship built over many years. My company did well, and after the first 18 months in business, I entered 1993 with a sense of financial security and a growing reputation in downtown Los Angeles. I didn't need to be in my office every day. I would go in a few times a week to oversee operations, make important decisions, and stay involved while allowing the company to function with a strong structure around it. Uncle Joey, Tate's favorite uncle, helped manage my financial affairs. He was well qualified for the responsibility, having earned a degree in finance and investments. His background and experience made him someone I trusted to help oversee my earnings and financial decisions. Joey had also served as Tate's power of attorney for years, which meant he was already experienced in handling important responsibilities on Tate's behalf. His role in both our lives was built on years of trust, loyalty, and careful management. To secure a loan for my business, I asked Uncle Joey to sign a guarantee document so the bank would approve an extended loan arrangement with a 5-year repayment period. Joey agreed without hesitation. He told me that if I ever defaulted on the loan or if there were any unexpected costs, taxes, or financial obligations, he would help cover what was required. His willingness to support me showed the trust he had in my abilities and in the work I was trying to build. Fortunately, my business succeeded, and I never experienced those negative consequences. I was able to repay Joey within the first 14 months of operation. The amount was relatively small because I had already provided approximately 80% of the startup funding through the resources available from my trust and my mother's inheritance. Repaying Joey was important to me because his support was not something I took for granted. He had stepped forward when I needed someone to believe in me, and I wanted to honor that commitment by making sure he was never placed at risk because of my decisions. I chose not to tell Tate about the loan because I remembered how strongly he had reacted when Mark paid the first 2 years of my college expenses before Tate stepped in and helped finance my junior and senior years. I wanted to handle this situation independently. I did not want Tate to feel responsible for my success or believe that I needed him to provide for me financially. I had my own resources, my own business, and I wanted to prove that I could build something for myself. Unfortunately, 6 months after the loan had been signed, Tate opened my mail at the Green Rambler. At the time, I had already saved nearly half of the amount I owed Joey, but I was waiting until I had the full repayment ready so I could write one check and mail it to him in Phoenix. When Tate opened the letter and discovered that his favorite uncle had helped finance 20% of my business, he became extremely upset. To Tate, it was not just a business arrangement. It represented another instance where someone he loved had stepped in to support me, and he struggled with the feelings that came with that. Tate hadn't intended to open the letter. He had been talking with me and picked up a stack of mail that was sitting nearby. Most of the letters were addressed to him, and he had simply assumed they were his. At the time, I received very little personal mail at the Green Rambler because most business-related correspondence was sent directly to my office. Tate knew I had started my own company, but he did not know about the loan. The only mail I usually received at home was from friends and family. Unfortunately, Joey's letter had been sent to the house instead of the office. When Tate opened it, he found Joey's congratulatory letter along with a copy of our agreement explaining that Joey had helped finance part of my business. Tate was deeply upset. He accused me of hiding the loan from him. In some ways, he wasn't wrong. I had intentionally kept it from him because I wanted to handle it independently and avoid making him feel responsible for my financial success. However, his reaction went beyond disappointment. Tate could become jealous and territorial, and when he felt hurt or excluded, he sometimes reacted intensely. In those moments, he would occasionally break things, including possessions in my home that were important to me. Looking back, I understand that the situation was about more than just a loan. It was about trust, independence, and Tate's difficulty accepting that people he cared about could support me without his involvement. I knew Tate had been jealous of the close relationship Joey and I shared. For years, Joey had been a surrogate uncle to me, and ever since Tate was 14, he seemed to resent the paternal affection Joey gave me. What always confused me was that Tate never seemed to direct that resentment toward me. Instead, he placed all of the blame on Joey. I often wondered why he viewed Joey as the person who had taken something away from him rather than recognizing that our relationships could exist separately and that affection was not something that had to be divided. Joey could sometimes be thoughtless without intending to be. There were periods when he would go long stretches without calling, sending a postcard, or coming to visit. When Tate was 16, a major snowstorm in Denver became a breaking point. After that, Tate became much less receptive to having Joey involved in his life. When Tate later discovered the letters I had sent to Joey, he became furious. He tore them up, and unfortunately, it did not surprise me that he also destroyed the letter from Joey that he had opened by mistake. Looking back, I think Tate's reaction came from a mixture of hurt, insecurity, and unresolved feelings about his relationship with Joey. But even when I understood where his emotions came from, it did not make destroying something meaningful or hurting others an acceptable way to express them. "What the fuck is this?" Tate said, holding up the letter. "A bastard is interfering in our lives again. Why didn't you tell me?" Then his anger turned toward me. "No, why didn't you come to me? I would have given you the money without making you pay it back. Sometimes I feel like you go to everyone else before you come to me for help." His voice became more emotional. "There are no strings when I help you, you know that. I like giving money, that's how I show my affection, but now I find out you went to someone else." He stopped, struggling to put his feelings into words. It's. He repeated himself before finally saying, diabolical. Then Tate tore the letter into 20 pieces. He stomped his foot in frustration and went upstairs, slamming his bedroom door behind him. What made the moment especially unusual was that Tate rarely went into his bedroom. He almost never used it because he had always shared mine. Seeing him retreat there felt like a sign of how deeply upset he was. For the past 10 years, Uncle Tim, Aunt Julia, and Uncle Joey had each tried to help me financially in different ways. They offered to write checks for various expenses, purchases, or investments for my future. Every single time, Tate reacted the same way. He would tear up the check, tell his family not to help me, or sometimes take the phone from my hand and end the call himself. Then Tate would provide the money instead. Tate was furious after discovering the loan with Joey. He stayed upstairs in his bedroom the entire day and didn't come down. Around 8 o'clock that night, I finally went upstairs and knocked on his door. There was silence, no response came from inside. I turned the knob and walked in. The lights were off and Tate was sitting alone in the darkness. "Tate, are you going to sit in here like a 4-year-old pouting and steaming?" I asked. Tate picked up a folded, weightless pair of socks and threw them at me. They bounced off my nose and landed on the floor. It was a small gesture compared to some of his other reactions, but it showed how overwhelmed and upset he was in that moment. He was struggling with feelings of hurt, jealousy, and the fear that he was being pushed out of a role he had always believed was important in my life. "If you reacted like a 24-year-old man instead of like a child," I said, "I wouldn't have felt the need to keep it from you. You have no one to blame but your own past behavior for why I didn't come to you first." Tate picked up another pair of socks and threw them at me. They hit my thigh, but they didn't hurt. It was less like being hit and more like someone tossing a rolled-up tissue across a room. Tate stopped throwing things at me. His entire body was rigid. He looked furious, but underneath the anger was something else: hurt, fear, and a feeling of losing control over a situation he believed he should have been part of. "You never used to lie to me," Tate said in an accusatory, jealous tone. "Ever since you turned 18, you've lied to me." His words reflected how deeply he connected my independence with rejection. To Tate, my decisions to handle things on my own felt like I was shutting him out rather than simply growing into my own life. Then he said something that revealed how complicated his emotions had become. "If you were my stuffed animal, I'd turn you over and spank you." At the time, I understood it as Tate expressing frustration through an immature attempt at humor and control. But the larger issue was that he was struggling to accept that caring about someone did not mean owning every part of their life or being the only person allowed to help them. "You're not going to spank me," I said. "Don't be ridiculous, I'm not a 4-year-old even though you might qualify." Tate threw another sock at me. "I told you to stop throwing things at me," I said. "If I wanted to be the target of your laundry closet, I would have signed up for it." I was trying to make him laugh, but I also needed him to understand that I was serious. "I'm a grown man, Tate. If I want to go to Uncle Joey for help, I can. I don't need your permission. What I wanted was your support, your emotional support." I explained that I had asked several people for advice and thought carefully about my decision. Choosing Joey's help was not about rejecting Tate. It was about making a choice that allowed me to maintain my independence and autonomy. When Tate heard that, his body stiffened. He stuck his tongue out at me like a child and turned away, facing the wall with his back toward me. In that moment, it was clear that the argument was not really about the loan anymore. It was about Tate struggling with the idea that loving someone meant allowing them to make their own choices, even choices that did not include him. "Tate, I'm going to have a conversation with an adult, not a child who sticks his tongue out at me," I said. "You're supposed to be the future CEO of the blue conglomerate empire. How would your stockholders feel if they saw the heir to the company acting like a jealous, spiteful adolescent?" I waited for his response. Tate simply stuck his tongue out again. "If my stockholders don't like it, they can go fuck themselves," he said. "I tell them what to think and I tell them when to shut their mouths." His voice carried the same defiance and anger he often showed when he felt challenged. "That's something you never learned to do," Tate hissed. The argument was no longer just about the loan or Joey's involvement. It had become a clash between two different ideas of love and independence. I wanted Tate to understand that accepting help from someone else did not mean rejecting him. Tate, however, seemed to experience my independence as a personal rejection, as if allowing others to support me somehow diminished his place in my life. "How much more do you need to pay Joey back?" Tate asked. "That's not any of your business, Tate," I replied. "The fuck it is," he said. "What's the number?" He pulled out his checkbook. "I'll reimburse you for everything you're giving back to Joey." I stared at him, almost unable to believe what I was hearing. "Tate, I don't want you interfering with my financial decisions or my business arrangements. I appreciate that you want to look after me and I'm grateful that you care about my future, but this agreement is between your uncle and me." "The fuck it is," Tate repeated. "What's the number? Make it quick." He pulled out a pen and waited. "No, Tate, I'm not telling you the number." He shook his head. "You always have to make everything difficult." Then he looked down at the pieces of paper scattered across the floor. "Fine, I'll just figure it out myself." Tate began collecting the pieces of the letter he had torn apart. He carefully taped each piece back together while I watched. It took him about 15 minutes of patience and concentration to reconstruct the document. When he finished, he looked at the numbers. "Looks like you owe $85,000, thank you," Tate said, almost matter-of-factly as he wrote the check. I watched him sign it, realizing that even in the middle of his anger, Tate's instinct was still to provide and protect. But I also knew that his desire to help was tangled with something more complicated, the belief that being the person who provided for me was proof of how much I mattered to him. "You always have to do things the hard way," Tate said, shaking his head. The argument had started as something simple. I wanted to make my own financial decisions, and Tate wanted to step in and solve the problem himself. But with Tate, those two things often became tangled. His instinct to protect me and provide for me could quickly turn into a need to take control of the situation. He seemed unable to understand that accepting help from someone else did not mean rejecting him. He had always viewed helping as an expression of love. To Tate, money was not just money, it was a way of showing that he cared, that he was dependable, and that he could make sure the people he loved were safe. The problem was that sometimes his desire to protect left little room for me to make my own choices. "There we are," Tate said as he tore the top portion from the check. He folded it carefully and walked over to me. He opened the pocket on the left side of my shirt and placed the check inside. "If you just did as you were told, we wouldn't have these altercations," he said. "But you always have to make things so hard, you just have to exercise your free will." He smirked as though he had won the argument and there was no possible way he could lose. "Don't you know it's pointless?" Tate said. I shook my head. "Tate, I told you I didn't want it." "Everyone says that," Tate replied. "Stockholders, potential clients, employees, they all say that at first, then they come around because they realize my way is always the best way. Besides, when they're making 3 times what they would make somewhere else, they usually change their minds." He looked at me, waiting. "Now say thank you, Tate, and let's move on. I forgive you for hiding it from me." I stood there holding the check, realizing that for Tate, the argument had never really been about the $85,000. It was about his belief that taking care of me was his role, and that my independence sometimes felt to him like a rejection of that role. Tate sat down on the bed and pulled me onto his lap. Looking back, it was a strange contrast. 2 grown men, one of them 24 years old, having a conflict that somehow ended with Tate trying to comfort me in the same way he had for years. In his own way, Tate was showing me that he forgave me for keeping the loan a secret. His anger had faded, but his need to make his point remained. "Don't even think about tearing up the check," he said, "and don't put it somewhere you'll forget about it." He looked at me seriously. "If I don't see that $85,000 coming out of my business checking account within the next 6 weeks, I'll spank you." The comment was typical of Tate's way of mixing affection, humor, and control. Even when he was trying to reassure me, he still had difficulty letting go of the belief that he needed to manage the situation. For him, taking care of someone often meant making sure things happened according to his plan. Tate ran his hands through my blonde hair. "Ah, it's always good to be the king," he joked. He kissed my cheek, the tension from the argument finally beginning to fade. "Now that you don't owe anyone any money, maybe we should go out to dinner," he said. "We could bring Susie or Andrew, someone along, have some fun, we can celebrate that your loan is paid off." In that moment, Tate had shifted from anger back into affection. The conflict was over and his instinct was to reconnect, to turn the situation into something positive and remind me that, despite everything, he wanted to share life's moments with me. For Tate, taking care of people was one of the ways he expressed love. The challenge was learning that caring for someone also meant trusting them to make their own choices. I woke up around midnight and realized Tate wasn't in bed with me. I got up and went downstairs and I immediately felt a sense of déjà vu. It reminded me of the night before I turned 18, when Tate had been on the phone inviting Emily to my birthday party. That memory had never been a happy one. Then I heard Tate talking on the telephone. It was no surprise that he was on the phone with someone, but what caught my attention was his tone. He sounded angry, furious, even. "If I want your interference in Noah and my relationship, I'll ask," Tate said into the phone. "And you know that will never happen. Stay away from Noe." There was a pause, and then his anger escalated. "Of course I'm jealous, you bastard." Tate was breathing heavily as he shouted. "You're not going to take him from me, fuck you." Then he slammed the receiver against the wall. Tate turned around, still visibly furious, and froze when he saw me standing there. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I could see the anger on his face, but I also recognized something beneath it, a fear of losing his place in my life. Whatever the conversation had been about, it was clear that Tate's emotions had once again moved beyond simple frustration into something much deeper and more complicated. "Remind me to call the old man tomorrow," I said. "I'm going to apologize for how his nephew treats his elders." Tate immediately looked at me. "Don't start." "What the fuck, Tate? It's 1 o'clock in the morning in Arizona. Did you wake him up?" I asked. "Because if you did, we're going to have a problem." "If you did, I'll apologize for you tomorrow," I said. "Joey did something kind for me and you have to be rude about it. Your uncle is a good man and the way you treat him isn't right." Tate's expression hardened. "You always take his side," he said. "You always have." "That's not true," I replied. "I'm saying he deserves respect." "He doesn't need you defending him," Tate snapped. "He already has you. Apparently everyone does. Everyone gets a piece of you except me." I shook my head. "Joey was there for you when you were a child. He gave you horsey rides on his lap. He took us out for ice cream. He gave you hundreds of gifts. He showed up for you in so many ways." Tate looked away. "And now, because he missed a few important days because of weather, work, or adult responsibilities, you want to treat him like he's garbage." "He left," Tate said quietly. "When I needed him, he wasn't there." "And that hurt you," I said. "I understand that, but hurting you once doesn't erase everything he did before." Tate crossed his arms. "You don't understand. You weren't the one he disappointed." "No, but I can understand being hurt without deciding someone is worthless." Tate's voice became sharper. "Of course you'd say that. He's your perfect uncle now. He gives you money, helps your business, and suddenly he's the hero." "That's not what this is about." "Isn't it?" Tate said. "Everyone wants to take care of you. Joey wants to help you. Mark helped you. Your friends help you. You have all these people you go to." His face tightened. "And I'm the one who's supposed to just stand here and accept that I'm not the person you choose first." I looked at him. "Maybe I've disappointed you," I continued. "Or maybe you've disappointed me. Does that give me the right to treat you the way you treat him?" Tate went silent. Tate's expression softened for a moment, but the hurt was still there. "That's different," he said. "How?" "Because I love you," Tate replied. "And when I love someone, I don't want to lose them." I nodded. "I know you love me, Tate, but love doesn't mean someone has to belong only to you. Joey's relationship with me doesn't take anything away from yours." Tate looked down, still frustrated. "I just don't understand why you need so many other people." "Because people aren't replacements for each other," I said. "Joey is your uncle, he's my friend, you are someone completely different in my life. Caring about one person doesn't reduce what I feel for another." I shook my head. "This kind of behavior might have been understandable when you were 15, I said, "but it's been almost 10 years. You need to grow up." Tate looked at me, but I continued. "I don't have to come to you first for a loan, for advice, or for anything else. I don't require you to come to me first before making business decisions, taking loans, or handling major parts of your own life. We are not children anymore." I paused. I don't want you to monopolize my time, my choices, or my relationships, and you don't need to check in with me before you live your life. If you want to share something with me, that's wonderful. I want to be part of your life, but I am not going to spend my life proving that I'm paying attention to you every second or acting as though I need permission to make my own decisions. Tate's expression shifted, but I kept going. I understand you're used to a different kind of relationship. We grew up together, we were used to depending on each other, but we aren't children anymore, Tate. I took a breath. I'm not going to let you pass this off as loving behavior when I tell you I don't want something and you ignore that. Caring about someone does not mean overriding their choices. I looked directly at him. When someone says no, the healthy response is to respect it. There is a word for people who refuse to respect someone's no. It usually ends with them being put on a registry where they can't go near nurseries, daycares, or elementary schools. The room became quiet. I love you, Tate, but love does not give either of us ownership over the other person's life. Tate pouted. Don't misunderstand me, I said. I love you, I want you in my life, you're very dear to me. I paused before continuing. But even people who are married or people who have been best friends for decades do not get to make decisions for someone else's life. Caring about someone does not mean having control over them. Tate, that's something every parent and guardian eventually has to learn. Children grow up, they become adults, they develop their own judgment, make their own choices, and build their own lives. I looked at him. It is not okay, under any circumstances, to override what someone says simply because you believe you know what is best for them. The only exceptions are situations where someone is at immediate risk of serious physical harm, legal danger, or is unable to protect themselves. Love means supporting someone, not controlling them. It means being there when they need you, not making sure they can only depend on you. I softened my voice. I don't need you to stop caring about me, Tate. I need you to understand that caring about me also means trusting me. I walked out of Tate's bedroom, giving him time to think about what had happened. Later, before bed, I apologized for keeping the loan from him. I understood why he felt hurt, but I also knew that I needed the freedom to make my own choices. Honestly, I don't think many of my friends would have blamed me for what I did. They understood that there was a difference between keeping a secret to hurt someone and making a personal decision because you were trying to preserve your independence. A few days later, Tate found the check he had given me in the kitchen trash. He completely lost his temper. At the time, Susie was over at the house, sharing hot cocoa with me. We were talking about a pediatric event Talia was organizing to raise money for the following Thursday evening when I looked up and saw Tate standing there. He was a grown man in his 20s, but his expression and posture looked like a child who had just discovered he wasn't getting his way. His arms were folded tightly across his chest. He stomped his foot, his blazing, jealous hazel eyes narrowed in frustration, and he stood there glaring at me. He towered over me, 5 inches taller and about 35 pounds heavier, but in that moment it wasn't his size that stood out. It was how overwhelmed he seemed by his emotions. Susie stopped drinking her hot cocoa and slowly looked up. She was seeing a side of Tate that many people rarely saw, an adult struggling to handle hurt, jealousy, and rejection in a way that looked much younger than his actual age. Susie tried to bring a little comedy into the situation. I swear, she said, throwing up her hands, Noah swore he was single. If I had known he was in a committed relationship, I wouldn't have come on this date. Please don't ruin my life and my employment. She laughed and took another sip of her hot cocoa, then added another joke. Maybe I should go so your husband here can spank you, Noah, she joked. Tate stomped his left foot a few more times. Yes, I said, teasing him. I treated Tate like a toddler who needed assistance and not like the adult juvenile who stood in front of me, stomping his foot out of jealousy and rage. Tate ignored the comment and picked up my mug of hot cocoa, holding it just out of my reach to finally get my attention about the seriousness of his anger. What's this? He asked, holding the check for $85,000. Hot cocoa, I replied. Then he reached down, bopping my nose so I'd try again. Not the cocoa, Tate yelled. He held up the check again. This. I looked at it and laughed. Susie started smirking, trying not to laugh. For a moment, the seriousness of the argument gave way to the familiar humor between us. Tate was still frustrated, but the absurdity of the situation made it harder for everyone in the room to keep treating it like a battle. Susie tried to add a bit more humor to the conversation. "Waiter," she joked, tugging on Tate's sleeve, "I'm out of hot cocoa. Could you get me some more whipped cream?" Before anyone could react, Tate grabbed the mug from her hand. The hot cocoa spilled across the table and the mug struck the coffee table and shattered. "Tate, what are you doing?" I said. He turned toward me, glaring. "I told you not to get rid of this check," he said. "Are you deaf, or are you just trying to get a rise out of me?" His anger was intense, and as he spoke, a small amount of spit from his shouting landed on Susie's cheek. The humor disappeared from the room. What had started as teasing and an argument over a check had crossed into something much more serious. Tate's frustration was no longer just about the money, it was about feeling ignored and losing control of a situation he believed he should have been able to control. Susie lowered her eyes and looked between us. "I think somebody needs a timeout or a diaper changed," she joked, trying to break the tension. But the mood had already changed. What had started as playful teasing had become uncomfortable, and Susie decided it was time to be quiet. Tate picked up the check, rolled it up, and shoved it into my pocket. "Tate," I said, pulling it back out, "I don't want it." He stomped his foot a few more times, still frustrated. "I think your husband here says otherwise," she said, referring to the check as though it had already made the decision for me. "Tate," I said again, trying to stay calm, "go get a cloth and clean up the table. You made a cocoa mess." He stared at me for a moment, but eventually walked into the kitchen. When he came back, he was holding one of my clean shirts. He began wiping up the spilled cocoa from the table. "Tate, what are you doing?" I asked. "That was a clean shirt." He ignored the comment and finished cleaning the mess. When he was done, he picked up the now-stained shirt, walked over and draped it over my face. Then he turned and went upstairs, slamming the bathroom door behind him. The entire situation was a strange mixture of affection, frustration, humor, and unhealthy reactions. Even when Tate was trying to make amends by cleaning up the mess, he still struggled with expressing his emotions in a mature way. "Wow," Susie said, "somebody needs a timeout and a spanking." She looked at me half joking but also genuinely concerned. "Do you let him act like that? Please tell me he doesn't do that in public." She waited for my response. I listened to Susie and slowly pulled the soiled shirt away from my face. I folded it carefully and placed it on the table. "He's really serious about the check," I said. Susie reached over and took my hand. "Don't let him get to you," she said firmly. "Just tell him no." I started laughing. After Susie stopped talking, I shook my head. "Tell Tate Blue no," I said. Me, the kid from a trailer park telling the heir to the Blue Fortune no. I laughed again, but there was truth behind the humor. Tate doesn't understand words like no, stop, or please don't. He doesn't register it because he doesn't want to understand it. Because if he did, then he would have to accept that he's responsible and culpable for how he reacts. Susie looked at me quietly. The hardest part was that Tate's actions often came from a place of love and fear, but that didn't make it acceptable for him to ignore my boundaries. Caring about someone did not mean getting to override their choices. 20 minutes later, Tate came out of the shower with a smug expression on his face. He looked like he believed the entire situation had been resolved, as if the argument was over, he had made his point, and everyone had accepted that he had won. He walked downstairs and sat at the table. "Hi, Susie," he said casually. "How long have you been here?" He acted as though she hadn't been sitting there during his outburst only half an hour earlier. "I'm fine," Susie said hesitantly. Then, trying to lighten the mood, she asked, "Did you get your 3 o'clock bottle feeding?" Tate wrinkled his nose. "Now that's all taken care of," he replied. He looked around the room. "Why don't we watch something? There are a few interesting movies on TV." I stared at him. Tate was acting as though nothing had happened, as though he hadn't stomped his foot, destroyed a mug, and turned an argument about a check into a battle of wills. "Tate," I said, "I'm not taking the check." I made sure my voice was clear. "You're just going to have to accept that." Tate looked over at me with a smile. "You're so cute when you get bossy," he said, reaching over and pulling on my cheek. You actually think you have a say in this, you're so funny. He kissed my cheek. I'm serious, I said, I don't want the check. Tate smiled as though he hadn't heard me at all. Instead, he turned toward Susie. So tell me about that pediatric hospital project my mother is sponsoring. Susie looked at me, clearly waiting for me to respond. Tate placed his hand over mine, which was resting on the tablecloth. I immediately pulled my hand away. The moment I did, he stopped talking to Susie. He looked down at the spot where my hand had been, almost as if he was surprised that I had moved away from him. A moment later, Tate reached across the table and placed his hand on top of my palm again. I moved away. Tate frowned. I'm serious, I said again. I'm not taking the $85,000 check. We'll see, he said. What do you mean by we'll see? I asked. You'll find out, Tate replied. We'll see after you come around to my way of thinking. He took a sip of his tea, as though the matter had already been decided. I shook my head. Tate, until you learn what the word no means when I say it, things are going to change. You'll be sleeping in your bedroom until further notice. No physical contact either around me. When it comes to my body, I am physically removing myself from your presence until you respect my boundaries. Tate looked at me with an expression that reminded me of someone who had just been told they weren't getting a Christmas present. He seemed genuinely hurt, but what stood out to me was how unfamiliar he appeared with the idea that he did not automatically have access to my attention, my space, or my physical affection. Tate had always acted as though closeness between us was something he was entitled to, that because we had shared so much of our lives, he had certain rights when it came to being near me. I needed him to understand that affection only meant something when it was freely given. Love and closeness did not remove the need for consent, respect, and boundaries. I'm serious, I repeated. I'm not taking the check, Tate. His smile grew into an even deeper grin. No, he said, shaking his head, you have to make everything difficult. And in that moment, I realized the argument was not really about the check anymore. It was about whether Tate could accept that I had made a decision he disagreed with and still respect it. Tate looked genuinely offended. Stop being difficult, he said, give me your hand. I shook my head. No. I said it louder this time, making sure he understood. Susie, sitting across from me at the table, looked up with wide eyes. She seemed almost stunned by what she was witnessing. Someone was actually telling Tate Blue no. Her expression practically said, alert the Navy. Tate looked at me, clearly not used to hearing that answer from me. No, he said, his voice becoming more desperate, give me your hand. But I kept my hand to myself. For Tate, the refusal seemed almost impossible to process. He had spent years believing that affection between us was automatic, that reaching for my hand, pulling me close, or offering help was simply part of who we were. What he was learning in that moment was that even the closest relationships still require choice. Affection is meaningful because it is freely given, not because someone assumes they are entitled to it. The rest of the afternoon after Susie left was filled with tension. The house felt unusually quiet, as though both of us were carefully avoiding another argument. By the time it was after 10 o'clock that night, I was trying to sleep when I heard my bedroom door handle move. The knob began to jiggle. I had locked the door, something I rarely did, but after everything that had happened, I needed space. I needed a boundary that Tate would have to respect. For a moment, it felt like we had somehow gone backward in time. It felt like we were 18 again, back in our childhood home, back when emotions were bigger than our ability to handle them. I felt like I had just graduated high school and was sleeping in the spare room, trying to create distance while still living under the same roof. Then I heard Tate on the other side of the door. He tried the handle again. The contrast was strange. Tate was a grown man with a large presence, someone whose physical size could fill a room, yet in that moment, his actions felt like someone struggling with the idea of being shut out. I stayed quiet, listening as he stood outside the locked door. For the first time, the boundary was not just something I had said, it was something I had enforced. Open the door, Noah, Tate demanded. Open it right now, I order you. The command was quickly followed by a different tone. Please, Tate begged. If Tate had been younger, the scene might have seemed almost funny. a teenager stomping his foot and ordering someone around like a spoiled little prince who expected the world to obey him. But Tate wasn't a teenager anymore. He was a man in his 20s standing outside a locked door, struggling with the fact that for once someone he loved had created a boundary he couldn't simply talk his way around. The irony wasn't lost on me. Tate had spent years being protective, generous, and deeply involved in my life. But he was now confronting the part of love he had the hardest time accepting. Sometimes loving someone means respecting the space they ask for, even when you don't like it. "Open it," Tate said in a shrill voice. "You do as I say right now." I didn't move. There was only silence. I could hear Tate breathing on the other side of the door, waiting for his lifelong companion to obey, to open the door and give the little prince what he wanted. "Stop being obstinate," Tate said. "Know your place and do as you're told. Open the door. I won't permit you to disobey me. Open the door now." The seriousness of his words was undercut by the way he sounded. It was almost like a child pretending to be in charge, trying to sound powerful because he wasn't getting his way. "Go to bed," I finally said. "I'm trying to," Tate replied. I paused. "You won't let me in." I had to fight the urge to laugh. There was something almost absurd about the situation. The same man who was used to commanding boardrooms, making decisions, and taking charge of situations was now standing outside a locked bedroom door because someone had told him no. "I told you," I said, "you're sleeping in your bedroom from now on." I lay back down, hoping he would understand and eventually walk away. For a few moments there was silence again. Then, the doorknob rattled. Tate was still there. The doorknob continued to rattle as Tate kept pulling on it. I stared at the door, listening to the repeated movement. "If you keep doing that, you're going to break it," I said. "Will you stop?" There was a brief pause. From the other side of the door, Tate chuckled. "Open the door, Noah." The way he said my name made me notice something. Tate usually didn't call me Noah. He had a different name for me, one he used when he was being affectionate or familiar. Hearing my full name meant he was angry. "You would dare keep me out," he said, "not after everything we've gone through." His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "Be a good boy and open the door, Noah." I stayed where I was. "No," I said. The word hung there between us. It was simple, but for Tate it seemed to carry more weight than I intended. He was used to affection being immediate, to disagreements eventually ending with one of us giving in. But this time, I was asking him to accept something he had spent years struggling with, the fact that love did not mean automatic access and closeness did not mean control. I heard Tate reach for his wallet. A moment later, there was a scraping sound against the side of the door. I realized what he was trying to do. Tate was attempting to use one of his credit cards to get the door open. It didn't work. The doors had been replaced a few months earlier. They weren't the old-fashioned kind anymore, and whatever trick Tate had expected to work wasn't going to happen. I heard him mutter and swear under his breath as he finally gave up. "You done?" I called through the door. "Go back to your bed like a good little boy and get some sleep," I teased. There was a pause. Then Tate kicked the door lightly. "Let me in, you." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. For a moment there was only silence. "I need my pillow to fall asleep," he finally said. I shook my head, knowing exactly what he was trying to do. "I'll let you sleep on top of me," Tate added, "if you let me in." That comment made me pause. For years, Tate had always been the one who took that position of closeness and comfort. He was used to being the one who held on, the one who made sure he was near me. The idea of changing that dynamic, even as a joke, was clearly another way for him to try to get past the boundary I had set. But the issue wasn't the pillow or where either of us slept. The issue was that, for once, I needed Tate to understand that when I said no, I meant it. "I thought we talked about this 2 years ago," I said through the door. "You need to respect my boundaries, go back to your bed, settle into your warm blankets, and go to sleep." For a moment there was silence. Then Tate kicked the door again, harder this time. "Tate, stop," I said. "You're not getting another door replaced this decade." But he didn't listen. From my side of the door, I could hear him putting his weight against it. The door began making strange creaking and groaning sounds under the pressure. "Tate, stop doing this." I could hear him shifting and trying again. "You are not acting like an adult right now," I called out. "You're acting like a spoiled prince who's upset because someone finally told him no." The struggle continued. For the next hour and a half, Tate kept trying to force his way through the door while I repeatedly told him to stop and go to bed. Eventually, around 3 in the morning, I reached my limit. "If you don't stop, I'm calling your mother." That finally got his attention. The noises stopped. The house became quiet. For the first time that night, Tate accepted the boundary not because he liked it, but because the argument had finally reached a point where he understood I was serious. I eventually fell asleep. I woke up the next day around 11, shortly before lunchtime. I yawned and tried to stretch, but something felt wrong. I couldn't move the way I expected to. I looked down and realized why. Tate was lying on top of me. What the hell, I thought, how did he get in here? He felt heavier than I remembered, and for a moment I was completely confused. Then I reacted. "Tate!" I shouted his name right into his ear. He immediately startled and nearly rolled off the bed. I sat up and started yelling at him, not just because he was there but because of everything that had happened the night before. "You broke through the door," I said, "and then you came in here and slept on top of me without asking." As I was talking, I noticed something in his pocket. A screwdriver. That explained everything. Tate hadn't actually broken the door down. He must have removed the hinges, which allowed the door to come loose and bypass the lock. I looked at him, frustrated and exhausted. Tate lowered his head, looking exactly like someone being scolded by a parent after getting caught doing something wrong. Except this time, it wasn't his mother standing there. It was me. And for once, Tate was the one being told that his actions had crossed a line. Tate looked back up at me, smirking like he thought I was performing in a play. "I caught myself a Noe," Tate bragged. He sounded almost triumphant. "I caught myself a Noe, I got myself a Noe." I stared at him, still trying to process what had happened. "I knew I'd win," he said with a grin. "You thought you could keep me out, but you couldn't, and now you're the loser." He repeated it almost like a chant, smiling as though he had just won some kind of game. Tate acted as if I had been playing hard to get, as if the entire situation had been a playful challenge between us and not a serious conversation about boundaries. He looked genuinely pleased with himself, like someone who had just won the lottery. But I wasn't smiling. To Tate, it felt like proof that our connection was unbreakable. To me, it was a reminder that he still struggled to understand the difference between affection and permission. Tate lay down on his stomach across the top of me again, looking completely pleased with himself. "If you want to play a game, Noe," he said, "all you have to do is say so." He smiled. "I always enjoyed it when you played hard to get back when we lived with our parents." Tate reached over and gently tugged on my cheek, letting it snap back into place. "You have the cutest, warmest cheeks," he said before resting his cheek lightly against mine. "Sometimes you can be so difficult," he added with an amused smile. "If you want my attention or you just want to have some fun, all you have to do is say so." Tate looked utterly satisfied with himself, convinced he had somehow turned the entire disagreement into a game that he had won. I, however, saw something very different. To Tate, my attempts to create distance had become playful resistance. He genuinely seemed to believe he had been teasing me rather than ignoring a boundary I had clearly set. His grin suggested he thought everything was back to normal, while I was left wondering how to make him understand that this had never been a game in the first place. I knew he wouldn't understand. How could he? Tate's arrested development made it difficult for him to distinguish between playful teasing and respecting a boundary. To him, my locking the bedroom door had become part of a game. To me, it had been a serious attempt to create space after an argument. A few minutes later, Tate climbed off me. "I'm hungry," he said. "I'm going to get some cereal. Do you want anything?" He spoke as though we hadn't spent the previous night arguing or sleeping in separate rooms. "No thank you," I replied. "Suit yourself," Tate said with a smile as he headed downstairs. I decided it was time to show Tate I meant what I had said. After changing into fresh clothes, I followed him downstairs. He had already poured himself a bowl of cereal and was sitting at the dining room table with a carton of milk, a bowl, and several boxes of cereal spread out in front of him. In that moment, despite being a grown man, he looked almost like a third grader happily eating Captain Crunch and mini wheats. I picked up the phone and dialed. "Hi Mark," I said, "how are you?" I listened for a moment. "Well, that's good." I glanced over at Tate. "I wanted to see if you'd like to go dancing tonight." Another pause. "No, it's fine, Tate isn't coming." I watched Tate stop eating, his spoon froze halfway to his mouth. "Yeah," I continued, "just you and me." I looked directly at Tate. "We can dance cheek to cheek and crotch to crotch." I smiled. Tate looked like he was about to have a bowel movement, but one look at his face told me he was nothing short of a jealous mess. "Pick me up at 6 o'clock. I listened for Mark's reply. "Okay, I'll see you then." As I hung up the phone, I looked over at Tate. He hadn't taken another bite of cereal. Instead, he sat there staring at me with an unmistakably jealous glare, clearly realizing that this time I intended to follow through on the boundaries I had set. "I forbid it," Tate said immediately. "Oh," I replied, smiling, "are you talking to me, big boy?" I walked over to the refrigerator and poured myself a glass of guava juice. Tate slammed the milk carton down on the dining room table to get my attention. "I don't want that pervert near you," he said. "He's always sniffing around you. I don't like him. I want him gone." I slowly shook my head. "He's not coming through the front door today. He's picking me up outside. We're going dancing, meeting up with a few of my longtime dance partners, and we're going to enjoy the evening." "I forbid it," Tate repeated, even louder, his voice carrying the same entitled certainty that I had heard so many times before. "Tate," I said calmly, "don't strain yourself, you'll give yourself a nosebleed." I leaned over, kissed him on the cheek, and started upstairs. Behind me, I could hear him let out an exasperated sigh, but I didn't turn around. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't arguing with him or trying to convince him to approve of my decision. I had made my plans, I had told him what they were, and I intended to follow through. Whether Tate approved or not was no longer the question. At 5 o'clock, I started getting ready for Mark to pick me up in an hour. I opened my closet. It was empty. My shirts were gone, my Gap clothes were gone, even my favorite club pants had disappeared. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty hangers. Tate. If he couldn't persuade me not to leave, he had apparently decided to make sure I couldn't leave at all. Without any clothes, I wasn't going anywhere unless I intended to walk out of the house naked. I closed the closet door and walked across the hall to the game room, where Tate was sitting as though nothing had happened. He looked up from what he was doing. "Where are my clothes, Tate?" He looked at me innocently. "I don't know what you're talking about." I folded my arms. "Don't insult my intelligence, you're the only other person who lives here." Tate's lips twitched into the beginning of a smug smile. "I have no idea where your clothes went," he said. "Maybe they decided they wanted a vacation." "Tate. They could have walked away." "Tate. They've been under a lot of stress lately." I sighed. "Where are my clothes?" He leaned back in his chair, looking entirely too pleased with himself. "I figured if you weren't dressed," he said, "you couldn't go dancing." He shrugged as if it were the most reasonable conclusion in the world. "So technically," he added with a grin, "I didn't forbid you from leaving, I merely complicated your transportation plans." I stared at him in disbelief. "Tate, hiding my clothes isn't clever, it's controlling, go get them." His grin faltered for just a moment, but he still looked unconvinced that he'd done anything wrong. "Where are they?" I asked, my voice firmer this time. Tate leaned back on the couch beside the gaming system, looking far too pleased with himself. "I put them in the one place you don't have a key to." "Tate," I said, my patience finally giving way, "go get my clothes, now, or I'm calling your mother." Tate just shook his head. "She's out of town, smarty pants," he said with a smug grin. "She'll be back tomorrow." He folded his arms behind his head, looking completely satisfied with himself. "You can threaten me all you want, but Mommy can't hurt me." He smiled as though he had just delivered the winning move in a chess match. I stared at him for a long moment. "So your solution," I said, "was to hide another adult's clothes because you didn't want him leaving the house." Tate shrugged. "You weren't listening." "No," I replied, "I wasn't obeying." That wiped the smile off his face. "There's a difference." He frowned. Tate, this isn't a game anymore. You don't get to decide whether I leave the house. You don't get to confiscate my belongings because you don't like my plans. Go get my clothes. He crossed his arms more tightly. No. The room fell silent. For the first time all afternoon, neither of us moved. Get my clothes. I enunciated every single word. I stepped closer until my face was only a few inches from Tate's. Instead of answering, he leaned forward and kissed me on the cheek. You're welcome, he said with a satisfied smile. I've already picked out 2 movies for tonight, Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park. You can decide which one we watch first. He stood up as though nothing unusual had happened. I want the extra buttered popcorn with almonds tonight, he continued, and you can have whatever dessert you want. He headed toward the doorway. Come on downstairs, Tate said cheerfully. I'll get the snacks. We can start movie night early. He was acting as though hiding my clothes had never happened, as though changing the subject would somehow make the problem disappear. I tried not to let him get under my skin. I really did. But I could feel my face growing hot with frustration. Tate, I shouted, my voice echoing through the house, go get my clothes now. He stopped walking. For the first time since I'd confronted him, the smile faded from his face. He realized I wasn't negotiating, joking, or waiting for him to distract me with another plan. The only thing I wanted was my clothes back. Tate looked back over his shoulder, smiling as though nothing was wrong. You're way too excited for movie night, he said. Come downstairs in 5 minutes. He shrugged. I told you I put your clothes in a place you don't have a key to, just accept it. He smiled even wider. Mark can show up in a few minutes, realize you're not coming and leave, then you can stay right here where you belong. Before I could answer, a familiar voice came from the staircase. What's all the shouting? Susie walked upstairs carrying a garment bag over one shoulder. I came over to help Noah choose something to wear. She stopped in the hallway and looked into my closet. Wait. Her eyes widened. Where are all of his clothes? I pointed at Tate. Ask him. Susie slowly turned toward him. Tate. He folded his arms with an expression that suggested he had absolutely nothing to apologize for. I relocated them. You relocated his entire wardrobe? Susie asked. He wasn't making good decisions, Tate replied matter-of-factly, so I removed the temptation. Susie blinked. You hid a grown man's clothes because he was going dancing. I prefer to think of it as preventative problem-solving, Tate answered. Susie stared at him for a long moment before looking back at me. Noah, she said quietly, he actually hid every single thing. Every shirt, I replied, every pair of pants, even my shoes. Susie rubbed her forehead. Tate, she said, you know that's not normal, right? Tate looked genuinely confused. I was helping. No, Susie replied, you were trying to decide for Noah what he was allowed to do. Tate frowned. Same thing. No, Susie said firmly, those are 2 very different things. Tate took another sip of his soda and smiled. Well, he said, since your plans with Mark the pervert are off, let's go downstairs and enjoy the evening. He glanced at the clock. It's only 15 minutes until 6. That's it, I said, I'm just going to go in these clothes. Before I could take another step, Tate's expression changed. No, you're not. Without warning, he threw the contents of his glass at me. The soda splashed across my shirt and pants, soaking the only clothes I had left to wear. There, Tate said, setting the empty glass down, now you can't wear those clothes. He smiled, looking entirely satisfied with himself. You're all out of luck. I stared down at my soaked clothes in disbelief. He had already hidden every outfit I owned, and now he had deliberately ruined the clothes I was wearing so I couldn't leave the house. Across the room, Susie stood frozen. Her mouth hung open. She had seen children throw tantrums before, but she had never seen a grown man behave this way. Tate, she said quietly. He looked at her as though he expected her to agree with him. Instead, she slowly shook her head. No, she said, this isn't funny anymore. The smile on Tate's face faltered for the first time since the argument had begun. I heard the front door open. Noah, Mark called. I honked twice but you never came out. Do you need a few more minutes? Before I could answer, I saw Tate smile. Then he reached into the corner of the room and picked up a baseball bat. My stomach dropped. I looked at Susie, and in that instant a terrible thought crossed my mind. Tate's going to hurt Mark. I bolted out of the room. Mark was standing in the entryway, looking around the house. "Hey Tate," he said, "where's Noah? He told me he'd be waiting outside." Then Mark noticed what Tate was holding. His expression immediately changed. He took an instinctive step backward. "Hey man," Mark said cautiously, "why do you have a bat?" For a moment, the house fell completely silent. The easy confidence Mark had walked in with disappeared, replaced by uncertainty as he watched Tate standing between him and the rest of the house, gripping the bat. Tate kept walking toward the front door with the baseball bat in his hands. Mark continued backing away until he was outside, the front door still standing open between them. For a split second, I didn't know what Tate was going to do. I wanted to believe he wouldn't actually hurt Mark, but seeing the bat in his hands made my heart race. "Get off my property," Tate hissed. "Put the bat down," Mark said, keeping his distance, "before somebody gets hurt." "That's my intention," Tate replied. Mark immediately put his car between himself and Tate, using it as a barrier. "I'm giving you 10 seconds to get off my property," Tate said, tightening his grip on the bat. "After that, I'll show you what I'm going to do to your car." I sprinted down the stairs. "Tate!" Susie was only a few steps behind me. By the time I reached the front doorway, Tate was still standing there with the bat, glaring at Mark with unmistakable jealousy. The tension in the air was overwhelming, and I knew I had to get between them before the situation escalated any further. Tate moved around the car as Mark tried to get away. In the chaos, Mark stumbled and fell backward onto the lawn. He looked up and saw Tate standing over him with the bat raised. "Mark!" I screamed. "Don't hurt him, Tate." For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then Tate threw the bat down near Mark's feet instead of swinging it. But the anger and jealousy that had been building all day had already taken over. Tate lunged forward and the two of them collided on the lawn. They began struggling as I rushed toward them. "Tate, stop." Susie was right behind me, calling out as well. The scene that had started with a disagreement over a check and a night of dancing had escalated into something neither of us could control. Whatever Tate was feeling, fear, jealousy, anger, or the belief that he was protecting something, had pushed him far beyond a normal argument. And now it was no longer about who was right. It was about stopping someone from getting hurt. Mark and Tate were evenly matched in size, strength, and build. Neither of them had an obvious advantage physically, but Tate had one critical advantage in that moment: he was on top of Mark with gravity working in his favor. The fight had moved beyond anger and words. I saw Tate's hands move toward Mark's neck, and my entire body went cold. "Tate!" I ran forward, heading around the car, trying to get to them before the situation became something none of us could undo. I wasn't thinking about the argument anymore. I wasn't thinking about who was right or wrong. I was only thinking about stopping Tate from hurting someone. Mark was struggling beneath him, trying to protect himself, while Tate's expression showed a level of rage I had rarely seen before. "Get off him," I shouted. Susie was behind me, calling Tate's name, her voice filled with panic. For the first time that day, there was no joking, no teasing, and no pretending this was another disagreement that would simply disappear. This was real. And I needed Tate to realize that before someone was seriously hurt. I reached Tate and saw what was happening. His hands were around Mark's throat. Mark's strength was fading, his movements becoming weaker as he struggled for air. The sight made my stomach drop. But what frightened me almost as much as the situation itself was Tate's expression. He didn't look like the Tate I knew, the person who joked with me, shared memories with me, and cared for me in his own complicated way. He looked consumed by rage. His face was tense, his eyes locked onto Mark, and there was something frighteningly distant about him. It was as if jealousy and anger had completely taken over, drowning out everything else around him. "Tate," I yelled. No response. I called his name again, louder. Still nothing. It wasn't that he couldn't hear me. It was as if he seemed trapped inside the emotion of the moment, unable to see the consequences of what he was doing. For the first time, I understood that this was no longer an argument I could win with words. This wasn't Tate being stubborn or dramatic. This was a dangerous moment, and my only concern was getting Mark safe and stopping Tate before something irreversible happened. Susie stood nearby, terrified, not knowing what to do. I reached for Tate's arm and tried to pull him back, but he was too strong. The adrenaline and rage seemed to have taken over, and I couldn't move him away from Mark. I pushed, pulled, and called his name, but nothing seemed to break through. I looked around desperately, searching for anything that could stop the situation. Then I saw the bat lying nearby. I hated what I was about to do, but I knew I had to stop Tate before Mark was seriously hurt. I picked it up and used the blunt end to give Tate a small tap, not with the intention of hurting him but to shock him enough to release his grip. The moment worked. Tate lost his balance and fell away from Mark. I dropped the bat immediately and rushed toward them. A small bump was already forming on Tate's head and he was unconscious. Mark was also unconscious, his body still from the struggle and the lack of air. For a few seconds, everything was silent. I looked between the two people lying there, my heart pounding. The argument that had started over a check, clothes, and a night of dancing had turned into something terrifying. This wasn't jealousy anymore. This wasn't a disagreement. Someone had almost been seriously hurt, and I knew we needed help immediately. I barely had time to react. Less than 20 seconds later, Tate moved again. He lunged forward, knocking me away as he reached Mark and forced himself back into the struggle. Tate, no. My voice came out in panic. But he seemed lost in the same overwhelming storm of emotion as before. The jealousy wasn't new. It had been building for years, quiet resentment, fear of losing his place in my life, and a possessiveness that Tate had mistaken for love. Mark had barely even been around him. Aside from one birthday party and another dinner at Tate's childhood home, their interactions had been limited. Yet somehow, in Tate's mind, Mark represented something much bigger. He represented the possibility that someone else could become important to me. All of those feelings, years of insecurity, jealousy, anger, and fear, seemed to come out all at once in that moment. But whatever Tate was feeling, it did not excuse what he was doing. I saw Mark struggling and I realized this had gone far beyond an argument or a rivalry. Tate wasn't protecting our relationship. He was destroying the trust and safety that any relationship requires. Tate, I shouted again. This time, I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was trying to reach the person I knew beneath the anger before it was too late. Tate hadn't seen Mark in 4 years, not since the Tina incident. Over time, I had started to realize that Tate had built an entire story in his mind about Mark and me. He seemed convinced that there had been some kind of relationship between us, something beyond friendship. The reality was different, but Tate's fear wasn't based on reality anymore. It was based on what he imagined could have happened. His deepest fear seemed to be that Mark had been with me in a romantic or sexual way, that Mark had crossed a line, or that I had chosen someone else over him. I didn't know whether Tate believed Mark had taken advantage of me, whether he misunderstood my own identity and feelings, or whether his jealousy had turned Mark into a symbol of everything he feared losing. But I did know one thing: Tate's emotions had become bigger than the actual situation. In his mind, Mark was no longer just my friend. He had become a threat, a person Tate believed had taken something from him. What frightened me was that Tate seemed unable to separate protecting someone from controlling them, or love from possession. Whatever was happening in his head, it didn't change the reality in front of me. Mark was a person. He was my friend. And he was in danger. I heard a buzzing sound. Then came the unmistakable crackle of an electric current. Tate screamed and immediately fell away from Mark. His body jerked as the shock took effect, and within moments he went still, unconscious on the grass. For a second nobody moved. Then Mark pushed himself upright, coughing hard. He was clutching a taser in his hand, his breathing uneven as he tried to recover. "Keep that psycho away from me," Mark said between coughs. He took another breath, still shaken. "Luckily I had my taser with me," he said. "I always carry it when we go clubbing." He coughed again, rubbing his throat. "What is wrong with that guy?" I looked between Mark and Tate. my mind struggling to catch up with everything that had happened. A few hours earlier, this had been about a check, a night of dancing, and an argument about boundaries. Now Mark was sitting on the lawn trying to breathe, and Tate was unconscious nearby. Whatever fears, jealousy, or emotions had driven Tate to this point, the reality was undeniable. The situation had become dangerous and everyone needed help. "Come inside," I said to Mark. "You need to lie down." Mark was still coughing and trying to catch his breath, so I helped him inside and had him lie down on the couch. I brought him some water and placed a warm cloth against his throat. As he rested, I noticed the marks left behind from the struggle, small indentations around the front and side of his neck where Tate's grip had been. Mark looked at me in disbelief. "What was his problem?" he asked. "We were just going dancing. I was going to bring you home by 2. Despite everything that had happened, the way he said it was so genuinely confused that Susie couldn't help herself. She laughed. She immediately tried to stop, realizing the situation was serious, but the absurdity of the contrast hit her. The night had been planned as a simple evening out, and somehow it had turned into something no one could have predicted. Mark shook his head. "I'm serious," he said. "I came here to pick you up for dancing. I didn't come here expecting a fight." Neither of us had. And that was the part that made the situation feel even more frightening. Tate was still lying on the front lawn, unconscious. Every so often his limbs twitched from the effects of the electrical shock, and I found myself looking toward the porch, wondering if I should go outside and check on him. But then I looked back at Mark. My priority was Mark. He was the one who had been struggling to breathe. He was the one sitting on the couch, coughing and trying to recover. Whatever was happening with Tate, Mark needed attention first. About 10 minutes later, I heard the front door open. I turned around. Tate had made his way back inside. He looked unsteady, almost as if his body was still recovering from the taser. He stumbled forward, catching himself against the wall. I couldn't believe he was already moving again. That taser had dropped him instantly, and yet somehow Tate was forcing himself back onto his feet. He looked toward Mark. Then he started moving in his direction. Not walking. Crawling. "Tate," I warned. But he kept going. He tripped over his own feet, struggling to stay upright, still focused on reaching Mark. In that moment, I realized something important. Whatever was happening inside Tate's mind, he was not thinking clearly. This wasn't a normal argument anymore. This was someone overwhelmed by anger, fear, and jealousy to the point where reason had disappeared. I stepped between them. "Tate, stop." This time, I wasn't asking him to listen as a friend, trying to calm him down. I was telling him because I needed to keep everyone safe. Tate was still several feet away from Mark when the situation took another disturbing turn. A hateful slur came out of his mouth, one that shocked me, not only because of the words themselves but because of the anger and hostility behind them. "Wait until I get my hands on you, you faggot. I'll put my fist so far up your butt you'll be spitting out blood." "Don't," I said firmly. The person speaking in that moment didn't seem like the Tate I knew. It sounded like years of fear, jealousy, anger, and confusion had all been twisted together into something cruel. Mark looked shaken. This was no longer just about jealousy or an argument between two people. The words themselves caused harm, and they revealed how far Tate's anger had escalated. I stepped between them. "Tate, stop. This is not who you want to be." For once, I wasn't trying to argue with him or convince him to understand my point of view. I was trying to stop the situation from becoming something even worse. Mark remained tense on the couch, still shaken from what had happened. He instinctively reached for his taser, his eyes fixed on Tate as he tried to figure out what Tate was going to do next. Then Tate said something that shocked me. "I'll teach you to rape my buddy." The accusation came out in the middle of his anger, filled with confusion and rage. Before anyone could react, Tate moved closer and his hand grazed Mark's shoulder. Mark reacted immediately. He activated the taser again. The sound filled the room as Tate screamed and collapsed to the floor, the shock forcing him back. Susie immediately covered her mouth with both hands. She stood there frozen, watching the scene unfold in disbelief. A few hours earlier, this had been about a disagreement over a night of dancing. Now, everyone was standing in the aftermath of something much more serious: fear, anger, and jealousy that had escalated into a dangerous situation no one could simply laugh away. Tate woke up 8 hours later. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. For a few moments, he seemed confused. He was still lying in the middle of the living room, a pillow placed beneath his head and a blanket draped over his large frame. His body still twitched occasionally as he slowly came back to awareness. Then his eyes opened. His first reaction wasn't confusion about what had happened. It was anger. "Where is he?" Tate demanded. He tried to push himself up. "Where is that homewrecker, that assaulting perv?" His voice grew louder. "Where is that thieving, assaulting, creepy little Mark?" I stood there watching him, feeling a mixture of exhaustion, sadness, and disbelief. After everything that had happened, Tate still saw Mark as the enemy. He was still trapped inside the story his jealousy had created, the idea that Mark had taken something from him, that Mark was the reason he felt threatened. But the reality was much harder for Tate to face. The danger hadn't come from Mark walking through the door. It had come from what Tate had done when he lost control. "Tate," I said quietly, "you need to understand what happened tonight." For once there was no teasing, no joking, and no easy way to move past it. The consequences were sitting right in front of us. "I know you're hiding him," Tate said. He didn't even say Mark's name. I shook my head. "He left. Susie drove him home." I looked at him carefully. "He could press charges, Tate. You could be arrested for assault and battery." Tate shook his head. "He deserved it." "What is wrong with you?" I asked. "He hurt you." "He didn't hurt me," I said firmly. I took a breath. "Whatever happened between Mark and me 4 years ago is none of your business. If he had hurt me, I would have handled it. I would have called the police. I would have made my own decisions." Tate stared at me. "I don't need you fighting my battles for me." His expression hardened. "If I ever see him again, I'll use my bat on his face." "No, you won't," I said immediately. My voice was calm, but there was no room for negotiation. "You are not going to hurt my friend. Mark has never hurt me." I shook my head. "Whatever has or hasn't happened between Mark and me was consensual and was part of our own relationship. It is not your decision to control, and it is not your place to punish someone because you're angry or afraid." Tate looked away. I pointed toward the room around us. "You're lying on the living room floor right now because you couldn't keep your hands to yourself." The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, there was no argument to distract from what had happened. No jealousy, no excuses, no explanation that could change the fact that Tate had crossed a line. "I know why you attacked Mark," I said. Tate looked at me. "You're terrified that he took advantage of me, that he hurt me years ago and that you needed to protect me." I shook my head. "But that doesn't make what you did right." Tate's expression stayed guarded. "You could have asked me," I continued. "You could have come to me and had a conversation. Instead, you created a story in your head and decided you knew the truth without ever asking." I took a breath. "You acted as Mark forced himself into my life, as he pushed me into something I didn't want, like he took something from me. That is not who Mark is." Tate shook his head as if he still didn't believe me. "Yes," I said, "Mark asked about sex before, that happened. But that does not mean there was manipulation, coercion, or some kind of abuse of power." I looked directly at him. "It wasn't because he paid my tuition. It wasn't because he had authority over me. It wasn't because he had more life experience or some kind of control over my choices." I paused. "Mark being gay does not make him a thief. It does not make him a predator. It does not make him a pervert." Tate looked away. "And the fact that you were afraid for me doesn't excuse what happened," I said. "You don't get to hurt someone because you're afraid they might have hurt me." The room became quiet. "This wasn't protection, Tate. Protection means listening to the person you're trying to protect. You didn't listen to me. There are enough witnesses to what you did for Mark to get a restraining order and have you picked up." Tate looked at me, but I didn't soften. "You're lucky I begged him not to press charges. He chose not to, not because he was worried about your reputation or your public image, but because he knew how much this would affect me." I shook my head. If you ever lay your hands on him again, I will call the police and I will have you arrested. Tate looked stunned. Not because I'm choosing him over you, I continued. This isn't about picking sides, it's about right and wrong. I took a breath. Nobody deserves to be attacked or targeted like that, especially someone who is being targeted because of who they are. I looked directly at him. Attacking a gay person because you're angry, jealous, or afraid is a terrible thing. You should be ashamed of what you did. I pointed toward him. You will write an apology to Mark. Tate opened his mouth to respond, but I continued. Not an excuse, not a justification, an apology. I lowered my hand. Because if you cannot take responsibility for hurting someone, then our relationship is over. The room went silent. For once, there was no negotiation, no teasing, and no way for Tate to turn the conversation into something else. This wasn't about jealousy anymore. It was about accountability. Tate sniffled. I looked at him carefully before I spoke. I don't care if you struggle with understanding this, I said. I don't care if you grew up hearing certain hateful Republican political ideas or if you believe in traditional values. You are allowed to have your own thoughts and beliefs. I paused. But the moment those beliefs turn into hateful words or actions toward another person, especially someone I care about, there are consequences. Tate looked down. You can believe whatever you want in your own mind, I continued. But you do not get to attack people, insult them, or treat them as less than human because they aren't straight, not in my presence, Tate. My voice hardened. You do not get to say hateful things about my friends, you do not get to say them to me, and you do not get to expect me to stand beside you while you hurt people. I took a breath. If that happens again, there will be consequences. I pointed toward the room around us. One of those consequences is that you won't be living here with me anymore. Tate looked up. And you may end up losing a buddy. The words clearly hurt him, but I needed him to understand that affection did not mean unconditional acceptance of harmful behavior. I loved Tate. But loving someone did not mean protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. I love Mark, I said. Tate flinched. He's a good man. I held his gaze. He has never taken advantage of me. He has never cornered me, pressured me, coerced me, or done anything to make me stay in his life or be close to him. I paused. Even if Mark wanted something more from me, he would still only have the right to ask. I would have the right to say no. I would have the right to set boundaries, and he would have the responsibility to respect them. I shook my head. And he has. I let the words sit for a moment. Whether or not Mark and I have ever had sex is not your business. Tate looked away. And I'm not saying that happened, but even if it had, it would not mean what you imagined. It would not mean he forced himself on me. It would not mean he pushed me down or took something from me. My voice became firmer. He has never used money to control me. He has never bought my silence. He has never made me feel like I owed him anything. I took a breath. He is my friend. He is someone who has supported and mentored me. You don't get to turn him into a villain because you're afraid of losing your place in my life. I pointed toward the table. You will write an apology. Tate looked at me. I don't care if you don't believe a single word you write in that apology. You are going to take responsibility for what you did. He swallowed. And I will be telling your mother. Tate immediately flinched. So expect a very angry voicemail coming your way. I turned away. I'm going to bed. I paused at the doorway. And in case you don't understand the situation, that is not an invitation to follow me upstairs, Tate. I walked away, leaving Tate alone with the consequences of what had happened. I made it halfway up the stairs before I stopped. I turned around and looked back at Tate. I'm extremely disappointed in you, I said. Don't let it happen again. My voice softened slightly. I still love you, Tate. For a moment there was only silence. Then about 10 seconds later, I heard his voice. It was the most childlike tone I had ever heard from him. I'm sorry, Noe. The words were quiet. There was no argument, no excuse, no attempt to explain himself away. Just an apology. I didn't answer. I continued upstairs and closed the bedroom door behind me, It was the same door I usually shut when I slept, but that dawn it felt different. It wasn't meant as punishment. It was a reminder. Love could still exist, even in moments of disappointment, but love also required boundaries. I climbed into bed and closed my eyes, listening to the quiet house below. I lay in bed, thinking about everything that had happened the night before. Tate had convinced himself he was defending my honor. In his mind, he wasn't attacking Mark, he was protecting me from something he believed had happened. He had created a version of events where Mark had hurt me and I was too forgiving, too trusting, or too afraid to say anything. But that version of reality wasn't true. Mark hadn't taken advantage of me, he hadn't trapped me, controlled me, or forced anything on me. Tate had been fighting an imagined enemy, and in doing so he had become the person causing harm. That was the part that hurt the most. Because underneath the anger and jealousy I could see where it came from. Tate's fear came from caring about me. He loved me in his own intense, complicated way. He wanted to believe he was the person who would always stand between me and danger. The tragedy was that he had forgotten something important. Protecting someone means listening to them. If the situation had been different, if Tate had simply come to me, asked questions, believed my answers, and supported me, his desire to defend me would have been one of the most touching things imaginable. But love cannot be measured by how fiercely someone fights for you. It has to be measured by whether they respect your choices, trust your voice, and protect your freedom as much as your safety. That was what I needed Tate to understand. Outside of the violence and the fear Mark experienced during the altercation, I could understand the emotion behind what Tate was trying to do. In Tate's mind, he was defending me. The frightening part was that his fear came from a place of deep attachment. Tate must have cared about me enormously to become so terrified of the possibility that someone had hurt me. He saw me as someone vulnerable, someone smaller than him, someone without his strength or physical presence, someone he believed needed protection. Tate had always viewed himself as the person who stood between me and the dangers of the world. If he hadn't given me ways to protect myself years earlier, I wondered if his imagination would have consumed him even more. He knew I went into places where there could be risks, especially during the club scene, and I think he carried fears about all the things that could happen when he wasn't there. But the painful lesson Tate had to learn was that loving someone does not mean taking control of their life. The instinct to protect someone can come from love, but real protection also requires trust. It means believing that the person you care about has their own voice, their own judgment, and the ability to make choices for themselves. Tate's fear showed how much he cared. His actions showed how much he still needed to learn about what love was supposed to look like. I was asleep and didn't hear the landline ring downstairs. Tate picked up the receiver quietly, lowering his voice so it wouldn't wake me up. He expected it to be a normal call. Then he heard the voice on the other end. "Mark." Tate's face immediately changed. The anger returned. "What do you want, perv?" Tate hissed into the receiver. "I'm not calling to cause a fight," Mark said. "I just wanted to tell Noah that there aren't any complications. I went to the clinic to get some ointment for my neck. Can you give him the message?" Mark waited for Tate to respond. There was a long silence. Then Tate's voice turned cold. "Fuck you." Mark didn't answer. "I know what you're up to," Tate said. "I know what you've done. You might be able to pull the wool over Noah's eyes, but you're not pulling it over mine." His grip tightened around the phone. "I've lived in Los Angeles my entire life. I know what people like you do. I know what happens when someone takes advantage of vulnerable people like Noe." Tate's breathing grew heavier. "You might have fooled him with your good guy routine, but I'm onto you. I can smell a chomo from a 10-mile radius while blindfolded and with my hands tied behind my back. I'm rich, so I know where all of these pervs are." Mark tried to say something, but Tate continued. "If I ever find out you petitioned my buddy to take off his pants, had sex with Noah, roofed his drink, took pictures of him when he was nude or unconscious, or tried anything with him, even if he turned you down, I swear I'll when your career gets you fired and make you a pariah on the Pacific coast." His voice was full of anger and jealousy. "You stay away from him. That includes your dick, your fingers, your devious little perverted mind, and your abhorrent fantasies about Noah." There was a pause. If you groom Noah in any shape or form, I'll take the shovel out of the back of my car, creep up behind you, beat your head in with my spade, separate your head from your neck and bury you in the garden outside my childhood home. Nobody would miss a slur like you, so come near my house again and you'll wish you were never born." Silence. Then Tate hung up the phone. The receiver clicked into place as he stood there in the quiet house, still convinced he was protecting me from something that existed mostly in his own fears.